Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is a look at the nervous system. So, when we look at the nervous system, we have some questions that we'd like to start with. Number one, how does an animal respond to environmental stimuli? So, there's a couple processes that make that response take place. The first is the sensory receptors. This is detecting the stimulus. So, something in the environment has caused a reaction that needs to take place by the body. So your body has to perceive that. The second thing then is the motor effectors, which respond to it. So you perceive it, and then you have some kind of reaction that responds to it. Now, you may think of this as the example of you're walking through your house in the middle of the night, Lego left out in the hallway or in the living room floor, and you step on it. So the sensory receptors in your foot are going to detect that stimulus of that Lego, and they're going to send that to the brain, or at least to the spinal cord and into the brain. And then there's going to be motor effectors that will respond to that will cause you to pick your foot up off of that Lego. Now, this process takes place very quickly. If you've ever stepped on a Lego, you know that. In fact, there's some research looking at whether that response actually makes it all the way to the brain before you've already had the motor effector that says, get your foot off of the Lego. That actually happens kind of in the spinal cord type area, that sensory receptor gets there, and then the signal is sent to move your foot. So what's the pathway to receive and respond to stimuli? Well, you've got the sensory neurons that carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the motor neurons carry impulses from the sensory nervous system to the effectors, which would be your muscles and your gland. So what constitutes the peripheral nervous system then? So the central nervous system we said was brain and spinal cord. That's pretty basic. What constitutes what we call the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS? So that's looking at the somatic nervous system, which are motor neurons that stimulate skeletal muscle contraction, and the autonomic nervous system, which are motor neurons that regulate the activity of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So when we look at the two here, you can see there is a region of the brain that deals with motor neurons. That signal would be sent then to a neuron then that will transport that from that where that reception is to that skeletal muscle. You've got an upper area that deals with that connects to the brain itself, and then you've got a lower area that's connecting to the actual spinal cord to that upper neuron, you could say. So the difference between the upper neuron and then the lower motor neurons you can see here in the somatic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, you've got the region that controls this primarily is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is then connected to those preganglion neurons, and then there'll be an autonomic ganglion. Now, a ganglion is kind of like a group of nerve cells, and so once that signal hits that group, from that group it'll actually fire in several directions, and you'll see then the ability to contract smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscles, adipocytes, whatever may be connected there. And there's also, of course, an area up high for the upper part of your body, and then an area down lower somewhere in your spinal cord for the other functions that take place. So you can see a little difference between the somatic, which deals with muscles, and the which deals with skeletal muscles, and the autonomic that deals primarily with like the smooth muscles. So what are two examples of neuroganglia? The two common examples are the Schwann cells, named after Theodore Schwann, but these produce a myelin in the peripheral nervous system. So here's a Schwann cell, and you can see these Schwann cells actually encase the axon of the nerve cell. So you've got here the dendrites would be here. Here's the cell body, and then the axon that sends the signal. But around those axons are these Schwann cells, and they have a nucleus, and they produce myelin sheaths, which are kind of like, if you will, they're kind of like rubber around a copper wire. You know, that rubber around the copper wire insulates it so that electrical impulse gets from point A to point B. So here, what happens is you'll have this little region right here, the node of Ranvier, which will allow an impulse to depolarize, and then from that point all the way through the Schwann cell, because of the insulation, it will pass very quickly from one section to the next. It won't have to like depolarize the entire thing. It can depolarize one region there at the node of Ranvier, and then send that electrical impulse from one end of that Schwann cell to the other because of that myelin sheath. The other is the oligodendrocytes. This creates a myelin sheath as well, but you see this in the central nervous system. So in the spinal cord and brain regions, you'll have these oligodendrocytes, which will actually create that myelin sheath around the nerves, but you'll notice where the nucleus of this cell is located, and it will actually be connected to several axons that it kind of reaches out to in several different directions. So how does a neuron transmit those impulses? Well, it does to a membrane potential, and you can recall from way back in AP biology here that we've talked about the membrane of the cell being that phospholipid with those protein channels and sometimes gated ion channels in there. So inside the cell membrane is more negatively charged in relation to the outside because of two factors. One is the sodium-potassium pump, and the other is ion-linking channels. So whenever you get, let's say, a response, you've got a more negative region inside the cell, you've got a more positive region on the outside, and the outside is where you find your sodium, the inside is where you'll find your potassium. Now, potassium will be able to leak out of the cell as well, but you'll find more potassium in the cell. So then there's some kind of impulse that's been generated. The ion gate will open and sodium will rush into the cell. When that happens, it causes the negatives in the cell to kind of flip. So you've got positive on the outside, negative on the inside. All of a sudden this gate channel opens, sodium rushes in, the negatives, it'll cause them to flip out. Now when that happens, that sends the impulse down the axon. Okay, after that impulse is sent, that membrane has to be polarized again. So to polarize that, you have the sodium-potassium pump. So you add a little bit of energy, it pumps those sodiums back out, pumps potassium back in, and in doing that, you reestablish that membrane. Now both of these are positives, but potassium is able to leak out of the cell membrane easier than sodiums can leak in. So yes, you do have sodiums being pumped out and potassiums being pumped back in, but the potassiums have an ability to leak back out of the cell membrane. There's two types of changes in the membrane potential. The graded potentials is small transient changes in membrane potential caused by activation of a class of channel proteins called gated ion channels. The action potentials are nerve impulse caused by depolarization, which is strong enough to cause a signal to actually be sent. It does this by reaching the threshold potential. It uses voltage-gated ion channels to control this reaction. So there's these little reactions, little impulses that don't really send much. These are graded potentials. So there is a reaction, but it doesn't really send the whole signal. And the reason is because you haven't reached what we call that action potential, that threshold. So then there's a stronger response, and it really depolarizes that axon, and boom, there that signal then is sent. How do neurons communicate with each other? They do so through synapses, which are junctions with the dendrites of other neurons, muscle cells, and with gland cells. And they do this through electrical impulses and through chemical synapses. Now, electrical impulses are whenever you have the direct cytoplasmic connection between two cells. It's a tight gap junction, so you've got two cells that actually meet together, and there'll be holes through there that signals are sent. This is seen in invertebrates, but not really invertebrates like ourselves. In us, what you have are called chemical synapses, which you'll have a synaptic cleft, so one ends, and the other is right here near it. So there's a gap between them. So whenever the signal is sent, it has to cross a space and be received then by the other. The neurotransmitters are released and bind to chemical or ligand-gated receptors. Let's see a picture of that. So here you can see, here comes the nerve impulse. As that nerve impulse comes, you've got these vesicles here, these synaptic vesicles with chemicals in them that will be neurotransmitters to serve the response. So as that is received, these vesicles will attach to the dendrite or to the axon, be released across the synaptic cleft, and you can see that cleft here, and then received by the dendrite on the other side of that cleft. And the degree to which it received will be the degree then that it will send, and an action potential will have to be reached, some kind of threshold, so that to say, yes, this is important enough to actually send the whole way. So how does drug addiction work? And this is an interesting time to talk about that, because a lot of drugs deal with the space there, that synaptic cleft. This example here is looking at the effects of cocaine. So without cocaine, dopamine is released and it is received then on the other side. But you've got dopamine transporters that will actually grab onto that dopamine and help control the amount of dopamine that's being received. Whenever cocaine is present, cocaine will block those dopamine transporters, and thus you'll have a bunch of dopamine received on the other side. Now, over time, what takes place is you'll have fewer areas for the dopamine to bind to, because the cell will know that that's not a correct stimulus over time. That's the problem. So it will actually generate less of those receptors, and it will generate less dopamine. So the problem with that over time then is, if the cocaine is not there, since there's less of them, you have to take more cocaine to help remove those blockers, so that the dopamine that is being produced will be received. And then if you stop taking cocaine, it will still be a while before your body will generate those responses back to normal levels. So that would be that detoxing period that a lot of people go through when they're trying to come off some kind of medication or some kind of drug. Their nerves are actually having to refocus and get back to normal. So how does the nervous system work with reflex? Like if you've ever gone for like a physical, they'll check your reflexes. A reflex is a sudden involuntary movement of the muscle. This is controlled by the spinal cord. So here you have the stimulus. This is the classic one that you'll go to the doctor and they'll tap your knee and it'll cause your leg to kick. So you get that stimulus, you get the nerve is sent to the spinal cord, and actually from the spinal cord sends back to the muscle to move the muscle. And you can see this is not a brain response, this is a spinal cord response. It's related to similar to that stepping on the Lego. That's kind of a reflex reaction. You jerk your leg up because there's something that is causing a different reaction than normal. You can see that here as well. You've got a nail or some kind of pin that's stuck into the arm. All right, the sent to the or somewhere in the body. It could be the arm. I guess it could be anywhere technically. There's a reception that's felt there. Hold on, my computer just went crazy. There's a reception that's felt there. It's sent to the spinal cord and immediately sent back to the muscle to cause a reaction to get that pin out of my body. All right. So how does the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, function? Through particular ganglia, aggregations of neuron cell bodies located outside of the central nervous system. So let's look here. So here we've got the spinal cord, the central nervous system, and then you've got a dorsal root ganglion. Now that dorsal root ganglion and the pre-ganglion neurons are right here together. And you get this response in the autonomic ganglion there that's going to actually send that response. So here you've got sensory neurons that are receiving, let's say there's food in the small intestine. They send a signal, but that signal actually doesn't go all the way to the brain. It goes through the central nervous system and curves right back around to go out to the post-ganglionic neurons that will cause those muscles then to help with digestion, and it'll cause things to be released to help with that digestion taking place. The last thing is the function of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. So here you've got the sympathetic, and you can think of this as kind of fight or flight response. The sympathetic is the fight or flight response. You've got the dilation of the eyes, the stopping of the secretions in the mouth, or the dry mouth that you may have experienced if you've ever been in a stressful situation. Dilation of the bronchial tubes, in other words, you'll start taking deeper breaths, the speed up of the heart rate, the adrenal gland will start releasing adrenaline. You'll start to decrease the secretions in the small intestines, and this will slow down your large intestine, decrease the movement of your small intestine, that sort of thing, slow down on digestion, so that you are able to go longer if you need to. And then as this is dealt with and kind of, as that fight or flight response is done and the body needs to go back to normal, then you go to the parasympathetic, and in the parasympathetic, you'll get the constriction of the eyes, the secretion of the saliva, kind of resetting of everything back to its normal levels. So the sympathetic deals with that fight or flight response, let's react. Parasympathetic says, okay, let's calm back down, let's get back down to normal.